Okay, today we're continuing Kashrut, and we're still dealing with the area of Basar ve'Halav, but we'll be going into another area which is similar, but somewhat different, called Ta'aruvot, mixtures, all types of mixtures. Not only Basar and Halav, not only dairy and meat, but all sorts of mixtures. And there are various concepts that we need to understand before we get involved. This time what I'm going to do is, instead of just going concept by concept, I'm going to give you examples, because that's what we left out from last week. Real life examples of what happens in the kitchen if the milk and the meat get mixed up, either in the pot or in the food, and so forth. One of the important concepts that applies, whether it's taruvot or basar ve'halav, is min b'mino. Min b'mino means that the two that are getting mixed up are the same type. They're both meat. One is kasher and one is not kasher. A typical example would be 2 kosher hot dogs and 1 non-kosher hot dog. Somehow they got mixed up. I don't know if that would ever happen. So let's maybe use another example. The kid brings home some candy. It's not kosher. And before we know it, he put it into the candy jar together with all the other candy. That would be an example of min b'mino. The candies look alike. They're the same type perhaps. You cannot identify which one is the non-kosher candy, right? So that would be an example of min b'mino, which may happen more likely than the one with the non-kosher hot dog, the non-kosher meat entering your house, somehow getting mixed up because the maid brought it in or some other way. I mean, it could happen. So we need to understand this concept. Because in basar ve'halav and in taruvot, it makes a big difference whether we're dealing with min b'mino or the next one is min b'she'eno mino. So I translate the min b'mino the same type, and the next one is different types. Different type would be, you have a non-kosher meat, let's say, mixed up with, something which is kosher, but it's of a different type. For example, vegetables. Vegetable soup, right? You have meat and you have vegetable soup. The two are different meaning, they're different types. Now you might say, well, that's easy, just take it out. You can see it right there. That's true. That may be true, that you may be able to identify it. And what would be the halacha? The halacha would be that there's no bitul as far as that piece is concerned. Remember we spoke about bitul, another important concept, that even though you have mixtures, whether it's basar ve'halav or ta'aruvot, you have something called bitul. Bitul meaning it cancel or annul and remove the problem, as though it would not exist. And we're going to be talking a lot about that today, the various types of bitulim. However, everybody agrees that if you can somehow identify, if you see the isur, like the piece of meat in the vegetable soup, it fell in, take it out. But there's still a second problem. Even though you were able to remove it and you're not going to eat that piece, we're still concerned about the tam. As I explained last week, there is another concept called tam ke'ikar. The flavor is very important. It is considered as the real thing. And the meat was there as the soup was boiling. Something not kosher, whether it's meat or not, was there while the food was boiling, and it may have left behind flavor. And that flavor is also asur. So we're now concerned not about that piece. We don't want to eat that piece. We want to eat the soup. Can I eat the soup? And there was flavor, something not kosher in there. So we said that as long as you have shishim, keneged, the isur, 60 times as much, that amount of 60 is powerful enough, the rabbis tell us, to remove any flavoring. Eventually, maybe next week, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some ingredients that are very special, that are so powerful, that they give much more flavor, that you always feel it, even in more than 60. There are various special types of ingredients, and when we talk about the candies, ice creams, and all these, we'll talk about preservatives and the like. There's something called davar ma'amid, which you see in cheese. How do you make cheese? By putting in rennet, which allows the cheese to coagulate, the milk to coagulate and to become cheese. There are various ways of making cheese. So some things are more significant, and they're not batel. Some of those things that are not batel we'll cover today in Chot HaAruvot. So for now, what we need to know is that 60 does help in many, many cases. The amount of 60 to remove or to cancel the flavor. Now, I did not explain well perhaps the idea of how 60 works when we gave an example of 2%. Remember we spoke about the 2% of an ingredient? So I drew it real quickly over here so you could see what I mean. Not the best drawing, quick drawing, but here you have, I think, 100. Right? You have 100, it's 100%. If you have 2%, it's not going to be 1 of 60. It's going to be 1 of 50. That is why whenever you have an ingredient in a product that it says 2% of such and such, there is no bitul. All right? Did I explain myself? Yeah. So 2 would not make it. But if you had only 1%, it would be fine. Because then you have 1 out of 100. What? You're right? Right, sometimes there's 2%. So you have to know that even though it looks like it's 2 out of 100, it's not. There's not 60. There's not a quantity of 60 to make it batel. What is that? No, there's various ingredients in the products we buy. Some have minute amounts, some have more. And sometimes it should tell you how much there is of each one. Alright, so min bevino is usually simpler. However, that's not enough. If we can identify that the two are the same, we need to make a second determination if the mixture is yavesh or lach. If the mixture is dry or in liquid form. Because what happens when you have liquid form, you have 2 pieces of meat. They're both meat, but they're being cooked together. So even though they're the same, the rabbis gazru, they decreed that it should not be batel berov. Min bemino is batel berov. All you need is not 60, all you need is majority. As with the hot dogs, if you had 3 hot dogs, one is not kosher, according to the din of the Torah, and I'm going to explain it a little bit more fully when we get to that, bitul berov, you would be able to eat them. There's a bitul of rov, 2 against 1. You don't always have to have double the amount. As long as you have more, that's called a rov. It's a mevatel et ha'isur, if it's yavesh. But even though it's min b'mino, if it's liquid form, what happens when you have liquid? Then you have flavor. And even though this is the same type, the rabbi said, you know what? We're going to treat this just like we treat min be'eno mino, where you need 60. But in reality, according to the Torah, it would be sufficient if you had rov. And why do we need to know what the din is min Torah? Because whenever we have doubts about something, if it's something that is asur, prohibited by rabbinic decree, it's more lenient. It's safek de rabbanan, nekula. If it's a safek d'oraita, we have a doubt about something if it's kosher or not. But the prohibition involved, the question here is about something that is asur min Torah. The Torah prohibits this, then we don't take a chance. It's asur, safek lechumrah. So we need to know what the real din is. So the real din b'min b'mino always is, the rov is mevatel. All you need is a majority. But once you're dealing with liquid form, and there's flavor involved, even though the flavor is still min b'mino, the rabbi said, you know what? You need 60. You will need 60 of it. So with the case of the candies, it's yavesh. It's dry. What do? It's batel berov, which I'm going to explain next. But before we get to bitul berov, min b'she'eno mino, if it's 2 separate types, 2 different types of food items, you always need 60. And when I say always, even though it's yavesh. Well, what's the problem if it's dry? If you have 2 different types of food and they're dry, there's no flavor. So what are we concerned about? That's also in the Rabbanah. We're concerned about that you may take these 2 and eventually cook them together. So it's a gzera, maybe you might cook them together. Once you cook, you will have flavor. And that flavor, according to many rabbis, is asur min Torah. So because you may come to cook, even though the min b'she'eno mino is dry, and whenever it's dry, you don't have flavor, we still need 60 times as much to make it batel. Yes. One more time. You have 2 things combined. You have a piece. No, let's say you have a piece of meat. Okay.
No, I'm talking about liquid. I'm not talking about solid. I'm talking about liquid.
Right. Right. Oh, if it's 2 liquids, yeah. There is a machloket in 2 liquids. If we say haticha na'aset nevela or not. Yeah. There's a question of whether you say that the whole combination becomes asur or not. But you could measure it, theoretically, if you know how much fell inside. We're talking about a couple drops fell inside, by mistake, an ounce or 2, and you know that this pot has 80 ounces, 90 ounces. It holds so many cups. So you should be able to tell. Yeah. But there is another question of whether we say hatichat na'aset nevela in the liquid form, because it's all being combined. Do we say that the whole thing is asur or not? So it becomes a little bit more complex, because everything is combined now. It's not really batel, in a sense. Yeah. Right. We're going to talk about that later. Yeah. All right. How does bitul berov work? Bitul b'shishim, I think I explained. You have 60. The 60 cancels out the flavor. 60 we're only dealing with flavor. What is this rov business? So there, if you look it up, there are various explanations on how it works. Because what are we saying? We're saying that if you have more of the kosher against that which is asur, the non-kosher is as though it does not exist anymore. How could that be? It's there. I just can't see it. But there is a din in the Torah, achrei rabim lehatot. If you're judging somebody's brought to court, and you have 3 judges, you always have an odd number, right? Because you have to decide. 2 don't agree. So how do we decide? How do we determine? By the majority. The majority rules. In Judaism, that is a very important rule. Achrei rabim lehatot, the majority decides. If there's any doubt about something, it's something which is not clear in the Torah, you go by the majority. There are various opinions, you go by the majority, as long as they're all qualified, of course.
As long as they're not wicked.
Of course, as long as they're not wicked, as long as they're qualified, and so forth. Okay? So that principle can also, according to some, be applied here, or at least to explain how Bitul Berov works, because that's a fact, that there is something called Bitul Berov. You have a candy, you can't recognize it anymore, it fell amongst other candies, and it's the same type, just one is kosher and the rest are not, the one is not kosher and the rest are kosher, it's batel. Can you eat all of it? According to some opinions, you can have all the candies yourself. Even the one at a time. Yeah, you can't identify it. It's batel. It's as though it's cancelled.
The minority is something that is done with the majority.
Right.
Here, there's no subjugation, it's still not kosher.
Exactly. So because of the concerns of those opinions who hold that this is not a true achrei rabim lehatot, because it's still there. It's not like with the liquid. What happens with the liquid? It really works. 60 dissipates the molecules, however you want to look at it. Well, let me finish this. So how does this bitul work? So there are different explanations, but because some opinions have concerns that this is not a true, like you said, subjugation, the minority is still there, they say one person cannot have all 3 hot dogs. One person cannot have all 3. Why? Because if he has all 3, especially at the same time, he's for sure eating the one that's tarif. So either he cannot eat them at the same time,
3 people,
or 3 different people can eat it because each one can claim he's eating the kosher one for a different reason. We're going to talk about it. It's called Kol de Parish Meruba Parish. Okay. Hopefully, if it's a piece of pork, you'll be able to identify it, right?
but if it's nevela,
You know where this problem arises. That example is, of course, not very common. The problem could arise when you have, like he said, several animals that were slaughtered. And some were found to be not kosher, 100%. In other words, nevelot or trefot. They all look the same. A cow looks like a cow. That's where you could have that problem of what do you do? Do we say throw the whole thing in the garbage or not? So we need to determine. So if it's min bemino, if it's yavesh, it's batel berov. I'm going to give you another example. Let's say you're in your kitchen and you say to yourself, I remember that one of the pots and pans in that drawer is tarif. Because I remember there was something cooked in the tarif. And I meant to throw it away, or I meant to make hagala, or I meant to give it away. And I never did. And I don't remember which one it is. What do you say? What should you do? Can you cook? One of those pots is not kosher. Same principle, right? Min bemino. But you will see that according to some it's not. It's called davar sheyesh lo matirin. Since we're already mentioning it, I'll tell you what that is. Davar sheyesh lo matirin means if something is asur now, but there's a way to make it mutar, then you can't have it now. You can take that whole drawer of pots and take it to the hagala and make him all hagala. What's the big deal? You can remove that doubt by doing something. Davar sheyesh lo matirin. So I'm going to talk about that soon. But I just gave you an example of it doesn't have to be food. You see? And this could happen even more likely in a house. Or with his example with nevelot and trefot, the same cows, min bemino. But with animals there are other issues which I'm going to talk about soon. So that's how the bitul berov works, but because some people feel that the isur is still there, some rabbis, some opinions hold that the isur is still there, they say you can't have them all yourself or you can't have them all at the same time. Some even go one step further, they're stricter and they say you have to throw out one of them. In other words, you have 3, one you have to throw in the garbage. And hopefully the one that you're throwing is the one that's tarif. Because you can't benefit from it, because it's there. So when you can identify it, there's no problem. You remove it. But then you still have a concern of tam, if liquid is involved. So you need the shiur of shishim. Here, you can't identify it. So if it's in liquid form, what will happen? Let's say you have goulash meat, and one of the pieces of goulash is not kosher. You brought several packages home and you didn't realize one of the packages was total non-kosher meat. They all look the same. And you made goulash, and the goulash looks all the same, but you cooked it all. So now you have two concerns: the meat and the rest of the dish, the liquid, the vegetables. Can you eat that? Well, once you have shishim against that one piece, or whatever amount of tarif, if you have shishim, then everything is mutar, even the meat itself. Not only the liquid and the vegetables, but even the meat, because you can't identify it. But if you could somehow identify, then of course you would have to remove that piece. If you see it, it's not batel. Batel is only when you can see it, or if it doesn't exist, like with the flavor. Yeah.
Get back to that one concept of the three hot dogs again, knowing one is non-kosher. And there's severe penalty for eating a meat that's non-kosher. You're talking Tim Tam Halev and other things. Why would you want to take that chance that you might pick up the wrong hot dog? The penalty is better off just passing on all three.
That was her question. Okay, fine. That's a good question. Why would you want to eat it anyway? For two reasons. First of all, the Torah says it's mutar. Once the Torah says it's mutar, there's no problem with it.
Okay.
That's number one. But number two, where you see it, where you understand it a lot better, is that this is an important issue when you've cooked and prepared a banquet, a feast for 300 people. And it's going to be a tremendous loss if you have to throw it away. You have to make a decision, And that's where these questions really comes up. If said merubev, there's a big loss. If it's Erev Shabbat, you do not have any other food. So we have to take all this into account consideration. So we have to be able to understand what we're dealing with. What is the exact problem over here? Is it really gone? Is it still there? Can I afford to throw it away? Of course, most of us, if it was 3 hot dogs, we'd just probably throw the whole thing in the garbage. Right, but that's a simple example. But you have to understand the concept if it applies in a bigger example, like with the dishes. And what should you do? Do you really have to bother and take it and make hag'ala on them? So we'll talk about that when we get to that. But that's the concept of bitul berov, that if it's yavesh, if it's nim b'mino, if it's the same type, then it's batel, it's gone. But some say you can't have them all at the same time, or not one person can have them. Or some say even more, you have to throw it away. You have to throw away one piece. Okay, so we spoke about bitul berov and bitul b'shishim. There are some food items that are never batel, afilu be'elef, even if there's 1,000. We'll just spend a few moments about that. One of them is called the birya, creature. A creature.
Like a bug on a lettuce, remember?
No, not a bug on a lettuce, exactly. A creature, there are various types of creatures that are considered creatures. It has to be intact. It has to have had life in the very beginning. It has to have been always a sur. There are various conditions of what makes a birya. But just to make it simple, a birya is an ant. An ant is an example of a birya. Now, why did I use an ant? Because it's small. Because if I would use a big piece of meat, right, then obviously, first of all, you could maybe see it. Not only that, we've already spoken about big pieces of meat, or any kind of meat, or generally speaking, any terefa. There's bitul berov and bitul b'shishim, depending if it's mim b'mino, or mim b'sheno mino, if it's yavesh or lach, if it's dry or liquid. Birya is something unique, that even if it's small, like an ant, and that is why I use the example of an ant, it's lo batel afilu be'elef. It would not be batel even in 1,000. If it's intact. If it's of course in pieces, you can't recognize it. It's a whole different story. But if it's intact, it would not be batel. Now that is maybe not the best example either, because either you don't see the ant or you see the ant. And if you see the ant, you can of course remove the ant. But you may have situations where the birya looks very similar, like all of them, right? It may look, the birya, it could be a kosher birya. Birya is a creature, anything that was created. It doesn't have to be an ant that was not slaughtered. How about that, right? It all depends on the circumstances, right? Depending on what, there are various situations where you could have a birya. And I'm purposefully, intentionally not saying a bug, because I have reserved something for that a little bit later. Yes?
You said before you wouldn't use a big piece of meat.
Right, I didn't want to use that,
But I mean,
because we spoke about bitul berov and bitul b'shishim, about just meat in general. But it has to be a whole creature intact.
So you can't have a cow or a pig or
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. What?
So you can't have a whole,
Obviously, we're not talking about that. Yeah. Yeah. But there are situations where maybe it could be. For example, if somehow you can't identify the animal anymore, and it's one of those unclean animals, The reason I use the example of an ant because it's very, very small, and that's the chidush over here. The chidush by birya is not so much the non-kosher animal. The chidush over here is that bitul berov and bitul b'shishim do not apply. Why? Because it's birya. It's an entire birya. Now, even the gid hanasheh, which is a sciatic nerve, is considered a birya, bifnei atzma, because it had life once upon a time, and it's something in itself. So even though that's not a living thing right now, it's still considered birya. So there are various items that are classified as a birya. But what you need to know is that if it's intact and it's a creature, then there's a halacha that afilu be'elef lo batel, that the rov and shishim, 60 do not apply. Even in 1,000, it does not get cancelled out. Okay, that's one of the items that would not be cancelled, the rov or shishim, even be'elef not. Now this could happen, of course, with bugs too. The reason I'm not using bugs now is because there's another concern about bugs. But the ant itself, if we were to use that as an example, is not batel. You would have to somehow look for it and remove it, and you can't say, well, it's batel. No, you would have to look for it, and if it's crushed, by the way, even though it's not called a birya anymore, if it's possible to use a mesanenet to filter out those biryot, those pieces of non-kosher food that got mixed, you would have to use that mesanenet to filter out anything that's left over. But now I'm going to get to the flavor in a moment. I'm going to get to that. That's why I left it out. The example of a bug. I just wanted to give you an example of something that is not batel, afilu be'elef. Why? It's hashub. It's important. It's a birya. No, malkot. If it's midoraita, it's a midoraita. This is only midrabanan. No, the birya she be'elef lo batel. Because if we go to the din of Torah, min bemino batel bero, or if it's liquid involved, it's 60. These are midrabanan, the few that I'm talking about right now, that are not batel, afilu be'elef. There are reasons for it. There are various items in the halakha that don't use the number 60 or the concept of rov. There's one that uses 61, there's one that uses 59, right? The one that uses 100. There's one that even 1,000 does not cancel it, does not remove it. And one of them is a birya.
Is that like a worm in an apple? Is that an example of that too?
No, because you can see it. That's not the
Take a
problem.
bite and then you see the worm. That makes the apple all...
No. We're going to talk about that next. That's not a problem. All right. Yeah. Yeah, the halakha of min b'mino that is batel berov is a din Torah. If you have two dry items, or even if there was liquid, according to the din Torah, and it's min b'mino, all you need is rov. If you have more of the kosher against the non-kosher, you can eat the whole thing, as long as you can't identify the isur. If you can identify... What? And not, if you could see it, obviously, because it's not. No, if you had, let's say, a birya, which was a min b'mino with whatever food you had. In other words, it looked alike. Or, I'm sorry, min b'mino would not be a good example because one is non-kosher animal, one is kosher, so it's really not the same min. But if it was yavesh, let's say it's yavesh. Midin Torah min b'she'eno mino, as long as it's yavesh, it's dry, and there's no flavor, it would also be batel berov. So this concept of birya is only coming to tell us the rules that we just learned of rov and 60 do not apply if it's intact. There's a whole birya there. Now you don't run into this a lot because usually it's crushed, or you don't know it's even there, right? But it can happen in situations. Yeah, if you have a whole animal, it could be possible. Kosher, that it's a kosher type of animal, but it cannot be consumed because of some problem. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about that next. So, yes, yeah. All right. Yes, a pigeon fell. I'm going to talk about that next. Okay, let's leave that. I'm going to talk about that's called tam pagum. I'm going to talk about the various things that fall in. Yeah, what happens to what comes out of them? Okay, that's next. All right, so that's birya is an example of something that is lo batel ve'elef. Then you have something that's called davar hamitkabed. You have a nice piece of steak. Davar hamitkabed. In other words, you would serve this by itself. In today's language, I think they would call it main course. Mana ikari. In other words, is this mana hareuya litkabed? Would you serve this by itself? It's lo batel afilu ve'elef. You cannot use the rules of rov. If this is a nice piece of meat, it's not a piece of goulash meat. then it's also not batel berov and shishim. So you probably never going to run into this, but it's good to know about these things so you know what the concerns are and what can go wrong.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
Davara mitkabed is only a piece of meat that is 100%. One second. That is not 100%. That is, it's not kosher. Identify it, right? Let's say you have a whole bunch of steaks that you're making. You have a whole bunch of steaks, and they're all reuyim letkabed. One of them is not kosher. Do you still say batel berov? No. It's davar hamitkabed, and because of that, it's not batel afilu be'elef.
No.
What?
So you have to throw all the steak down?
Right, exactly. So all the steaks are tarif. It's not batel. What? Naknik is not davar mitkabed. Only because of that. And some even say that a chicken, let's say a chicken with the feathers, got mixed up somehow. And later, everything, and it was not kosher. And it was, later of course they cleaned it up. It's not davar mitkabed. At the time it fell in, you wouldn't serve it like that. So even though it's big, it has to be ready to be served, and it has to be like a main course, a nice big piece. It's a special isur of hashivut. They didn't want to make it batel. Actually, I left out one here that I didn't write it down, and I'll tell you right now. It's called davar shebeminyan. If you regularly count it, you sell it not by the pound, you sell it by number. This is $25 a piece. Davar shebeminyan, also not batel be'elef. All of these, what they have in common is that they're important. And hashuvim, therefore, midrabanan, rov and shishim do not apply. It's not batel. Davar sheyesh lo materin that we briefly explained before is something that will be mutar. An example, an egg that is laid on Yom Tov. You can't have it that day. You can't touch it. It's muktzeh. Fruit that fell from the tree, right? On Shabbat, you can't eat it then. You can't pick it. Of course, right after Shabbat, after Yom Tov, you can have it. So if that got mixed, if that egg got mixed with other eggs that was laid on Yom Tov, you can't have it. It's not batel berov. Why? It's going to be mutar the next day. You follow me? So because it's going to be mutar the next day, you don't say it's batel now. Very simple. It's a very simple concept. Meat is always taref. So if it's taref, you need to know if it's batel or not. Right? So davar sheyesh lo matirin is not batel either. Wait! When it becomes, that is why I gave you the example of dishes. How are pots and pans, dvarim sheyesh lehem matirin? Make them all hagala, and you make it mutar. Why should you make it batel? So what's the answer to that? The answer is, according to many rabbis, you don't have to make him all hagala. It is batel. Why? Because it would require a tremendous amount of effort to take all your pots and pans and make him all hagala. Obviously, if it's only 3 or 4, maybe you'd want to do it. But if it's a lot more than that, it's not considered davar sheyesh lo matirin because it's too difficult. So it's not called sheyesh lo matirin. It would come under the category of min b'mino, pots and pans of min b'mino. You don't know which one it's batel berov. It's just batel, and you don't have to make the other ones kosher by agala or limun or whatever. Okay, the next point is tam pagum. Okay, so now you have a big water beetle fall into your soup. A water beetle, right? A water beetle, is that what they're called? A water bug? It looks like a cockroach, but it's bigger. Okay, but it likes the water. Anyway, so of course you're disgusted by it, and you remove it from the soup. But now you're concerned about what came out of it, what it left in the soup. Let's not maybe use a cockroach. What about a bee? A fly falls in. Of course you're not going to eat it, but what about what it left inside? Anything that comes out of these little bugs is mutar. Mutar. What comes out of these bugs does not make the food not kosher.
Small mixture there, Rabbi?
Yeah, what comes out of them, yeah. Now eventually we'll talk about some things that come out of a non-kosher animal that is tameh. Kol hayotze min hatameh tameh. That's another type of isur that eventually we'll get to. But with the example of bugs, what comes out of bugs is not a problem whatsoever. So of course you have to remove the bug. It's a bidiyah, first of all. And it's a shedet, or whatever, you can't eat it. But what comes out of it, you don't have to be concerned. You don't eat shishim. You don't have to be concerned. If you still want to eat it, it's okay. Yeah, a fly pellet, you remove it. Now, however, what if what if a mouse or a certain type of non-kosher ingredient, I'm going to be very neutral now, ingredient fell into the soup, and it's not batel because there's quite a bit of it, or there's very little of the kosher food. However, this particular ingredient that fell into this mixture, upagum, either it itself has a terrible taste, or the combination of the two spoils the whole thing. So what you have here is, let's say, a mouse. You can't see it obviously anymore. Okay? Or some other ingredient. Shepogem et hayayin. It fell into wine. You can't see it anymore. It was liquefied, or who knows what. But it's not batel, because it's not enough to make it batel. It's okay still. Why? Because zetam pagum. It's mutar. Mutar. Now, where would this be bichlal shayach? Where is this shayach? Most of us, of course, would not need it if we ever find out shenafal letoch ha'ma'achal izeh akbar, that some mouse fell in, right? Or some other ingredient which is not kosher, which of course we would be discussing. I actually put it in a category of this by itself. Ma'us, disgusting. What's the din? The din is that because, actually ma'us is something a little bit different, but they're similar. If it's pagum, if the flavor is defective, either the ingredient itself is very bad, or the combination of the two make it very, very bitter, mutar, because this is not real tam. So remember, we needed shishim for tam, but if it's tam pagum, you don't need it. That is the whole idea of why in basar v'chalav, it's important for us to determine if this keli is ben yomo or eno ben yomo. Was it used today or not? Because any vessel that was not used today, that was used 2-3 days ago, the last time it was used for meat, and now you made your habita, you made your omelet with cheese. You just made your cheese omelet, and you realize that it was sir besari, but it hasn't been used for at least 24 hours. That tam, in that meat pan, or meat frying pan, is pagum. So even though there's flavor, it's a flavor which is pagum. So whether the flavor is pagum, or whether the combination of the two foods becomes pagum, it's mutar. No problems with the tool. Where is this shayach, besides kelim shenan b'nei yoma, besides vessels that have not been used? Where is this tam pagum very, very significant? Where the hashgacha wants to be aware of this? Pagum means defective. It's a very bitter. Where does this make a difference? In medication. That's where it makes all this difference. If what they're putting into the medication is a very, very defective and bitter, it could be mutar. Or even better than that. You know what's better than tam pagum? If it's eno ra'ui le'echol, eno ra'ui le'achila, you would never be able to even eat it. It's so bad. It's so dried out. It's so whatever, right? It's not edible. Then for sure it's not a problem. You know where this is a question? Where do we need to deal with this? With gelatin. Where do they use gelatin? In ice creams and candies, non-kosher gelatin. And even though today there's kosher gelatin, it's very expensive. They try to get it from fish. They try to get it from all sorts of other sources. But the best is gelatin from animals. But the problem is you have to have gelatin from kosher animals that were slaughtered kosherly. Otherwise, what's the difference if it's from a cow, if it was not slaughtered? It's a nevela. And what's gelatin? It's made from the bones. But bones are dry. So you see, so there are situations that you may be able to have it. Where would you want to have gelatin?
Yogurt.
No. We don't eat yogurts with gelatin. Capsules, exactly. Gel caps. A lot of the times the gel caps, and people like to have gel caps because they can't swallow the regular tablets. The gel caps may have gelatin to make it soft. Can you have it? If you need to have it, yes. Why? Because it's not ra'ul le'achila. You can't eat gel caps. It has no flavor. Forget about tam pagum. It's not even edible. לא, מעמיד זה משהו אחר. מעמיד זה משהו אחר. אני לא אדבר עכשיו על מעמיד. We'll talk about rennet and cheese some other time. About the coagulating ingredient. But we have something that's pagum or eno ra'ul le'achila, and it makes a difference, because if it's something which is not ra'ul le'achila, it's your best bet. The reason for that is because if you have a lot of it, if you have a lot of the tam pagum, a lot of it, not just a little bit, we don't eat it. Nobody eats it, even if it's pagum. Only if it was a little bit. But if you have a lot of the isur, which is lo ra'ul le'achila bichlal, you can have a lot of it, and it's mutar l'chatchila afilu. If you need it, if there's a real need for it, you would be able to have it. If it's not ra'ui le'achila, even on Pesach, when we talk about chametz, we're going to talk about this idea of not ra'ui le'achila. If it's chametz, you have shoe polish that has chametz. Can you have it in your home on Pesach? Not ra'ui le'achila. You're going to eat it ever? But perfume, you better believe it, that even though not everybody drinks perfume, but soldiers did at time of war. Sure, it's like whiskey. So it is ra'ui le'achila. So there's a difference, yes.
What about vitamins?
Vitamins is a different problem because vitamins may have flavor. So for example, if you're buying cough medicine, right, you want to make sure, if possible at all, that there's no grape flavor. The grape flavor could be a problem in cough medicine. So anytime there's flavor, like vitamins or liquids, it's more of an issue. But if it's something that is not lo ra'ui le'achila bichlal, or if it's pagum, it's lenient. It's more lenient. Yes.
What about the example, a restaurant, for example, where some kosher restaurants for meat,
Right.
and a rodent, a rat, would take bites out of it. Would that cause the meat to be anything, or would that just cause you to forget?
Well, just anything that a rat or cat ate from causes forgetfulness. But it's not a sur.
It's not a sore.
It's not a sur, no. Okay, let's quickly go over to some real-life examples. We spoke briefly about baking in an oven, basar v'halav, or somehow it happened that it was non-kosher food too. The concerns that we have in an oven, just to remind you, is the ze'ah, is the steam, the vapor that goes up. So if you always bake with the pots covered, it would not be a problem. But there are items that are baked, that are open, that are not covered, and therefore what we do is we do not do it at the same time. Some people do not even do it at the same day. But if you have to use the oven the same day, not at the same time, but the same day, for meat and dairy, make sure that you cover at least the meat. And after, when you're ready to do your dairy, turn on the oven for at least 20 minutes on 350 or 400 degrees, whatever you used to cook your meat, and make sure the inside is clean. With the microwave, we also said that the problem exists with the steam. Even though it's a different technology, it's always best to cover the meat. You don't want to have the vapors inside. And a lot of times what happens, I've noticed, is that on the platter that you put the food, a lot of times things spill on it. So you want to make sure that's clean. And the meat is covered, and some people put a cup of water in between to let the steam out. But most of us use microwave anyway, only to warm up food, not to cook food. So you don't have to be that strict. But it's always best, of course, to cover, if you can, for health reasons and for kashrut reasons, to cover the food when you put it in a microwave oven, unless it's for a minute or something. All right, the next real-life examples are the problems that we encounter with meat and milk. Okay, a serious problem. What happens if some drops of milk fell on a pot of meat? Drops. You might say drops. Well, if it fell inside, there's no big deal. Because as long as you have 60 times, it's okay. You can have the cholot, you can have the hamin. If you can figure out, you for sure have 60 times, as much as a few drops or an ounce of milk that fell in by mistake, you can have it. It's batel b'shishim. It's cancelled. What happens if it falls on the pot itself? If it fell on the pot, but it fell on the level of the pot where it's close to where the food is, right? Let's say the pot is only half filled, and the drops fell on the portion of the pot which is where the food is inside, then we look at it as though the drops went inside, and as long as you have 60, it's okay. Inside. We're talking about right now outside of the pot. The biggest problem is when you have drops of milk falling on the outside of the pot or on the lid where the food is not reaching. Because what happens is then the whole outside of the pot becomes asur, because the drop spreads, and you may not have 60 times as much in the food keneged against that entire area of the pot that now became tarif. So you have to be careful. If that ever happens, of course, consult a rabbi, because there's various things to be aware. At that point, you have to pour your food on the other side of the pot and not on that side. And you're better off waiting until the pot cools down before you do that. In other words, there's various things to be aware. If that ever happens, it's a big problem. Because you may not have 60 times as much in the pot against an entire area that got moist, that became wet of milk on the outside of the pot. Unless, of course, it was the pot, it was the area where it's right next to where the food is. And we're talking about pot on the fire, so it's all boiling. So if it's the If it's the spot of which is keneged, right in front of the food, then we say it went inside, it penetrated, and you have enough. If you have enough 60, zebatel. But if it's on top, this is one of the areas of alachai basar b'chalav that can cause problems. If it's on the portion of the pot where the food did not reach to, so it cannot mix with it, so that drop can scatter or splatter and make an entire area, not just one spot, an entire area asur, and you may not have enough. You may have the whole thing become asur. But it all depends. If the flame was on that side, it could have burnt it up. In other words, there's various things to consider. And as I said in the very beginning, there are many issues that you may want to consult a rabbi with. This is one of those areas that if it ever happens, tipot chalav, on the pot, you need to ask about that because that could become a problem. Yeah. Yeah, right outside, but it penetrates. Remember, it penetrates. It's boiling. It's boiling. The pot is boiling. The food is boiling. So even anything that falls on the outside can enter inside. The problem is that it goes in. Yeah, the heat allows it to penetrate. So if it's next to the food, we welcome it because now the food can combine with it and be mevatel. But if not, and it splatters on the area of the pot where there's no food there, then a whole large area can become. Then you don't have enough in the food to cover it. So anyway, there are too many details here. I just wanted to give you an example of something to be concerned about. That if that ever happens, you need to consult with the rabbi. Yeah. It's a problem because even though the food never reached there, we suspect that we are afraid it might, and that is why we take precautions. Even though in reality nothing happened yet, and that is why I suggest to just wait until it cools down, and then pour it on the other side because that's what you should do.
What if you wiped it off immediately?
Obviously, if you took care of it immediately, it's different. Yeah. Anytime you had a chance to quickly take care of it, it's no problem. All right, let's quickly go to the next one. A little bit of milk falling into pieces of meat, and the meat is not inside the pot, it's sticking out of the liquid, because if it's inside the liquid, we have shishim. But it's only one piece of meat that was affected. You might be able to just remove that piece of meat, and you don't have to be concerned about the rest of the pot. Also, there are quite a few details here, whether the piece of meat was halfway in or was completely outside, there was no liquid. And what about that piece of meat? Could you have it? Well, if you're a Sephardi, you would be able to ask a goy to taste it. Remember we talked about that? If you're Ashkenaz, you have to have enough in the mixture to make it batel. In the case of the piece of meat where no liquid was involved, all you would need is to remove any tila, or where it came in contact with. And regardless of whether it's batel or not, you would have to remove, because it's hot, you would have to remove a piece of the meat because it came in contact with it while the meat was hot. All right, the classical examples of what you may run into more often are spoons and bowls. You're making yourself a cup of coffee, you want to mix the sugar and the milk, and by mistake you realize you took from the drawer a spoon which is besari. Now what do? So now you have to use your head. You have to remember the concepts of kli rishon, kli shani, kli shlishi, whether this is the first vessel, a second vessel, a third vessel, whether the liquid is yat soledet or not, whether it's very hot that you wouldn't want to stick your finger in. Most of the time, the cup of coffee is a kli shani. So guess what? Most of the time there's not going to be a problem here. You will be able to have your cup of coffee even though you mixed it with a spoon, even though that spoon is a ben yomo, even though that spoon was used that day to make goulash. This is a kli shani. Kli shani lo mevashel, right? But that spoon is taref. Now, not always, right? It may become taref. The spoon at least can become taref if the kli shani was very, very hot, or if it was a kli rishon, right? Let's say you put the spoon into a big pot. The mixture in the pot you have no concerns. Why? Because it's for sure 60. But the spoon becomes taref. So you have to make hagala. Even if the spoon was eno ben yomo, because if the spoon is not ben yomo, you for sure don't have a problem. Because even if there's no 60 in what you're mixing, the food is still kosher because we spoke about tam pagum. So the first thing to determine whenever you have mixtures in the kitchen, I used the wrong thing. Well, wait a second. First of all, what kind of a keli am I dealing with? Kli rishon or kli shani? Second of all, am I dealing with something which is ben yomo or eno ben yomo, the one that's mixing? Because I'm concerned about the mixture of the food or not. If it's ben yomo, then I have to determine if it's batel or not. Is there enough quantity in the food to make the food kosher? But that still does not resolve the issue of the kapit. That always becomes tarif. The biggest problem is when you have everything ben yomo. and there's no shishim. The pot was used that day for milk. The meat spoon was used that day, and there's no 60. Not only is everything asur, but now the pot has a mixture in it of basar and halab at the same time, and it's asur. You cannot use it to cook anything in it. No basar and no halab. It's asur because it has basar and halab. You would have to make hagalah. Whereas the other case, if the pot was not ben yomo, right? If the pot was not ben yomo and you mix an ingredient of milk into the meat pot, but the flavor inside was not ben yomo, then not only will the food be mutar, you could theoretically use it to cook vegetables. Our custom is not to use any pot or any spoon or anything that has a mixture of basar v'halab in it, absorbed, whether it was ben yomo or eno ben yomo, you make hagalah. But theoretically, you would be able to use it for other things, not with meat or with milk. You can't use that pot with milk or with meat because now it has both, even though one is pagum. But you would be able to make other things, or cook other things. But we don't use it. Anytime, therefore, especially in a kli rishon, where you had the mixture of the meat and the milk, you're concerned about the contents first, you determine if there's bitul or not, if you need to make the determination. Once you've made that determination, you have to figure out what happens to the spoon itself. We spoke about a ladle. Even though I mentioned a spatula last week, I really meant a ladle. A ladle is what you pick up soup with. So if you're removing the contents from a kli rishon, that ladle continues to be a kli rishon. Even though it's a second keli, it continues to be a kli rishon, and it's very, very hot. So if it's of the wrong type, it would of course be asur, and you would have to figure out if you have enough in the pot to make it batel. Real quickly about nat bar nat. Okay, last week I spoke about if you're on an airplane and they serve you a cup of coffee, a mug, make sure to ask the for a styrofoam cup or a glass, not for china, because as we will speak about later about the various vessels, china, it has a problem of absorbing and not letting out. You will not be able to make a good hagalah on it, and it may have something not kosher inside of it. Whereas with glass, it's not a problem, and styrofoam cups for sure not a problem because even if it's after 24, it's better not to. You're right, it's tam pagum. But lechatchila, we don't eat tam pagum.
How about the spirits pot?
I'm going to speak about that in a couple of weeks. The various types of pots and how to make hagalah, how to make libun for them. What do you do? Because there is a difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim when it comes to glass.
Okay.
Sephardim, they can use it for both meat and dairy.
Glass.
Yeah, you just have to wash it out. But we're mahmir. Yeah. Yeah.
You were talking about the bugs on the lettuce. Why are you such a severe error, Rabbi?
Eventually, the bugs, tolaim. That's maybe next week actually. We're going to be talking about all other types of prohibitions. In the past couple of weeks, we've done basar v'chalav and taruvot, meat and milk and mixtures. And beginning with next week, the next 3-4 weeks, we'll be dealing with wine of a goy, bishul akum, right? The various types of prohibitions that we need to know how to deal with, what to do about them. Right now, we're concerned with these various mixtures. Yeah. Right. אם יש רוטב, if there is liquid. כן, אז זה יכול להיות שזה בטל ברוב, זה בטל ב-60. אתה צריך 60, ברגע שיש לך רוטב אתה צריך 60. לא, זה משהו אחר, זה לא בטל, אם זה ראוי להתכבד. תלוי, זה נחשב ראוי להתכבד, רגל זה לא ראוי להתכבד, זה מדי גדול. A whole leg is too big. לא, זה לא. רגל של העוף, לא. Yes. Okay, the last few minutes we have is just a few more points over here. We have the din of kisui gdera. You have to be careful not to use the wrong top of a pot. You use the top of a meat pot to cover the pot. You might make the whole thing asur. You would have to have 60 against the flavor absorbed in the top, because they both become hot. Mixer. Don't use a mixer for both dairy and meat. Even though it may be of glass, you're dealing with metal parts. The only thing is that if you did make a mixture in there, that mixture, you may be able to use it with meat, with dairy, even though you use that for meat. I'm sorry, let's take better an example. Let's say you're making a milkshake. That's dairy, right? Can you eat it? No, I'm sorry, no, not a milkshake. You've used it once for dairy. It has become dairy because you used it for milk. But now you're making something else which is parve. Can you have that parve ingredient with meat? Yes, because it's not barnat. It could be a situation where it's noten tam bar noten tam. It's a weaker flavor, because it's not the real thing. It's only a flavor coming out. It's like the rice, making rice in a meat pot. You can have that rice with cheese later. Not for Ashkenazim, but for Sephardim. But be careful not to use it for both. Decide what you want to use it for. It's always best to make the mixer parta, because once you use it for dairy, you could have issues of nut but nut. Ham b'ham, if you have no liquid involved, you have hot piece of meat touching cheese. Well, then it all depends which one is on top of the other. But what if you're not dealing with food? Let's say you're dealing with a pot. You put hot food, very hot burning food, into an empty pot of the wrong type. Then you're in trouble, but not so much trouble. Because there's no liquid involved, you would only have to remove a small piece of the meat, but the kli, you would have to make hagala. There's no liquid involved, so only a small piece becomes a surah. Alright, the last items are not that significant for today. The only one that's left here that I discussed briefly was davar shu ma'us. Anything which is disgusting, don't eat it. Even though it may be batel, right? Even